for world-weary travellers at France's busiest airport, a supersonic transatlantic journey was a dream come true. The joint French-British designed Concorde was itself the realisation of an aviation dream. Cruising at twice the speed of sound, it cut the transatlantic flight time by more than half. Elegant and sleek in design, it embodied sophisticated technology and an international spirit of achievement. For the 100 passengers boarding their Concorde flight to New York, this was a long-awaited day.
The charter flight with the flight number 4590 operated from Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport to New York Kennedy. It had 100 passengers and 9 crew members on board. The aircraft took off at Paris at 4:44 local time and crashed just right after the takeoff. All on board, as well as 4 other persons on the ground, were killed. The nationalities of the passengers are as follows: 96 German citizens, 2 Danish citizens, 1 American citizen, and 1 Austrian citizen. In accordance with laws in Europe, next of kin in Europe are expected to be notified by government officials in their country of residence.
At 4:42 p.m., Concorde was cleared for takeoff, a routine flight that turned out to be far from normal.
J'ai vu, j'étais à côté de... Je quittais mon lieu de travail sur l'aéroport de Roissy. Sur la piste de décollage, j'ai vu le Concorde qui partait en direction de New York qui décollait. Et d'un coup, d'habitude, il fait beaucoup de bruit, mais là, il y avait encore plus de bruit. J'ai regardé, le réacteur, il a éclaté, il a pris feu. Il y avait de la fumée qui est repartie dehors. Il y a une grande fumée pratiquement sur toute la piste de décollage, il a pris feu. Il a quand même décollé en prenant plus de vitesse. Et après, il s'est écrasé 20 secondes après sur l'hôtel-restaurant qui est derrière.
The mysterious fire and the crash itself had investigators baffled. In its 25 years, the Concorde had never had a crash. With this one accident, based on the ratio of deaths to kilometers, its safety record had gone from the world's best to worst.
Il n'y a pas d'éléments nouveaux établis par rapport à ces communiqués. Donc vous savez les faits que nous savons, ceux qui sont établis. Sur quoi nous travaillons? Nous travaillons sur tout. Nous travaillons d'abord pour comprendre chacun de ces faits que nous avons identifiés. Entre autres, un éclatement de pneus. Pourquoi? Comment? Pas de moteur. Pourquoi? Comment? Un feu. C'est une fuite? D'accord, mais pourquoi? Comment? Etc., etc. Nous cherchons à comprendre également comment chacun de ces éléments s'enchaîne. Ce n'est pas simple, mais on progresse.
The fatal crash of the Air France Concorde left the world reeling in shock and disbelief. How could this have happened? The flight tower recording shows that the plane was already accelerating down the runway when the tower alerted it to a major fire around one of its 4 engines. Now too late to abort takeoff, the pilot's only option was to get the plane into the air and make an emergency landing at nearby Le Bourget. The Concorde was designed to cope with an engine loss, but a second engine had problems. With insufficient airspeed, the plane became uncontrollable, and within 2 minutes of takeoff, plunged into a hotel in Gonesse, just 6 kilometers away. Emergency services raced to the site, finding a hellish scene. All 100 passengers and 9 crew from the plane were killed. At the hotel, 4 staff members, 2 Polish, 1 French, and 1 Mauritian, were also dead, while a lucky few escaped with burns. Aviation experts immediately set to work, investigating the cause of the disaster. They began the painstaking process of sifting through over 1 million pieces of wreckage in search of answers.
Something dramatic has gone wrong. The Concord crews are, they're the elite. They're specially selected men, both in Air France and in British Airways. So they're very, very highly skilled pilots. They're very, very highly trained.
The distraught families of the victims faced a long, painful wait for the bodies to be removed and formally identified. Two days after the crash, relatives, friends, and co-workers attended a memorial service in Paris. Of the 113 dead, 96 were Germans on their way to join a cruise ship. Many of these ran local businesses and were community leaders. One town lost 3 generations of a family. The children, parents, and grandparents all died in the crash. Immediately after the crash, British Airways cancelled that evening's Concorde flights between London and New York. Next morning, the airline resumed normal Concorde services.
It's tragic what happened. Obviously, there's probably a bit of a hollow feeling, but I think the fact that they're flying this morning shows a great fighting spirit.
Over the years, the Concorde had developed an extremely loyal customer base. Now, despite the shocking news, many of these passengers retained full confidence in the aircraft.
At the last count today, we had 12 cancellations. These are people who really did not want to travel in view of the circumstances, quite understandable. But at the same time, we had almost equally the same number of bookings and people who were still interested in going.
In France, all Concorde services were suspended indefinitely, pending the investigation. At the moment the Concorde plummeted into the Hotellissimo, Alice Brooking was the only guest currently in the 40-room hotel. She was in her room waiting for an English tour group of 50 due to arrive shortly.
The whole floor started to tremble and I realised something was up. So I went straight for the door of the hotel room that I was in, saw all the flames, saw there was no way out via the stairs or anything, and obviously just went straight for the window.
Alice jumped from her first floor room and ran as the plane exploded, engulfing the hotel in flames.
The heat was absolutely amazing. It was like being in an oven.
Alice had been on the phone to her sister, Natalie, when the plane struck.
The last thing I remember Alice saying was, oh my God, what's that noise? And then it's just undescribable. It was just like a thunder earthquake, massive impact.
Escaping with a burnt arm and traumatic memories, Alice would at least return to her family. At a press conference 6 days after the crash, French investigators revealed results of the accident inquiry so far.
First, let me say that we are working with colleagues from the British AAIB, also from colleagues investigators from Germany, and we have also joined with us people from the American NTSB and the American FAA. As it was said in French, we are working to understand what happened. We have some facts scattered. For the time being, it's not possible to say what's the link between those facts, what's the cause of those facts, or what's the possible consequence of any of those facts. We found on the runway evidence of tire burst. Excuse my English if it's not the best one. We found also evidence of fuel leakage, and this is this leak which eventually took fire. And this is the cause of the fire.
There were work done on the plane just before the flight, and there was a slight delay, and then the plane took off.
What kind of work?
It was a work on an engine.
The Concorde was meticulously designed, yet its incredible speed on takeoff and landing were hard on the superinflated tires. Tire bursts had been an ongoing problem, some causing damage to fuel lines and engines, and there had been many modifications to the aircraft and tires to minimize damage. But investigators believed this situation was unlike any other. A regular tire burst would not explain the extreme chain of events, the engine failures, undercarriage problems, and the huge fire on takeoff.
Well, up to now it has been quite impeccable. I mean, it is, well, that really wants to be emphasized, because it has done remarkably well, I think, for a very advanced aeroplane, and it shows that a lot of the tremendous amount of testing that was done, a lot of which has never really come out in the open, particularly all the structural testing, really has paid off. And the design of the aeroplane itself is a tremendous credit to those people who did it.
In 1962, France and Britain jointly embarked on the project to develop a supersonic aircraft. The Concorde, meaning agreement, pushed design, engineering, construction, and testing into new territories, creating a passenger jet decades ahead of its time. The prototype Concorde 001 flew for the first time at Toulouse, France in 1969, revealing the iconic design with the delta wings and famous needle nose, so essential to its speed.
And now she's ready for takeoff. And there she goes.
1 month later, it was Britain's turn, with Concorde 002. It accelerated down the runway at 315 kilometers an hour before lifting gracefully into the air. Soon it completed the first of many supersonic flights. Before long, Air France and British Airways were successfully running Concorde services, in the first year carrying 45,000 paying passengers. Together, these flights clocked up more than 5.5 million kilometers, much of these at Mach 2, 2,160 kilometers per hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. As you notice, we're coming up to twice the speed of sound.
Well, we've had the most excellent supersonic lunch, and we couldn't be more comfortable, and it's the most tremendous and very exciting experience.
Oh, it's been a wonderful experience. I think that thrust through to supersonic, I've never been through that before. Somehow you sort of feel the aeroplane means it. It knows where it's going, and I feel we need to know where we're going. It's been a lovely experience.
Within America, local concerns about noise levels saw the Concorde banned from landing in the US. After much negotiation, services finally began into Washington. In a spectacular show of ceremony and solidarity, the Air France and British Airways aircraft flew together over the US Capitol, landing simultaneously on parallel runways. Monitoring and analysis of noise levels in Washington showed them to be less than expected and within acceptable limits. Finally, 18 months after Washington, Concorde services were allowed to begin in New York. 3 weeks after the crash, British Airways was ordered to suspend Concorde services indefinitely, pending further results. Now, nearing the first anniversary of the crash, the final report was released.
La première chose, ça a été un léger choc sur la piste quand la roue a heurté une lamelle métallique qui traînait par là, qui avait été laissée par un avion américain qui avait décollé quelques instants plus tôt. Il Immédiatement après, l'appareil a commencé à partir légèrement sur la gauche, ce qui a obligé le commandant de bord à rectifier sa trajectoire. Immédiatement après, diverses alarmes ont retenti dans le cockpit, notamment une alarme incendie concernant le moteur numéro 2, que le mécanicien a coupé. L'aile gauche était en flammes, s'étant fait une fuite de carburant d'un réservoir qui est placé dans l'aile, légèrement avant le réacteur. C'est pour cela qu'on a pensé à un feu de réacteur au départ. Et disons, la fuite de carburant a été provoquée par un choc avec des débris de pneus qui avaient éclaté en heurtant la fameuse lamelle.
1 year after the crash, mourners gathered at the accident site, a barren, sad wasteland. During the past year, the area had been off limits while investigations continued. This was families' first opportunity to actually stand at the crash site and commemorate their dead, which they did with a simple but moving wreath-laying ceremony. While nothing could take away their loss, most families of those killed in the plane accepted financial compensation from Air France. For families of those killed in the hotel, no compensation was offered. While grounded, the Concorde had been extensively modified and tested to address tire damage issues. In November 2001, the airlines resumed services and passengers welcomed the aircraft's return. Tickets sold well. Passengers on one London to New York leg happily shelled out £7,000 each for the privilege. In a post-September 11 world, the airline industry suffered a lengthy downturn, with many casualties. The decision was made to retire the Concorde.
It's a sad day, but we've come to it for two reasons. Firstly, the demand for premium travel, particularly on Concorde, has declined quite substantially over the last 12 months. And also the cost of maintaining her and keeping her aloft is going up quite substantially.
For British Airways alone, this was an £84 million write-off, a loss that could potentially double if the airline maintained the Concorde for a few more years. Passenger priorities had changed, and it was time for a reappraisal.
We'd love to have a supersonic replacement for Concorde, but at the end of the day, the real question is, can either of the major manufacturers, Airbus or Boeing, produce a supersonic aeroplane that can replace Concorde and can do so at prices that make it an aeroplane that's available to a wide range of customers?
The focus was no longer moving people in less time, but moving people at the same time. Airbus developed the A380 to do exactly that. It's the world's largest passenger jet, the culmination of a £5.7 billion development over 10 years. It is massive, as tall as an 8-story building and as long as a football field, and can carry as many as 850 economy-class passengers.
It could be a bit of a godsend for the very busy hubs of the world. Nobody wants new runways. The local people, or the people who live near the airport, don't like it, so the airports have got to find ways of getting more out of the runways that they've got, and being able to operate bigger airplanes will enable them to do that. Bigger airplanes don't necessarily need bigger or longer runways. This one certainly will not do that.
Many airline companies configure the twin-deck plane for 3 classes, with features such as bars, private suites, shower spas, lounges, and an electronic art gallery. Even with such luxury, the typical configuration carries 525 passengers, more than 5 times the Concorde's capacity. Air France and British Airways had originally intended to both end services at the end of October 2003. However, poor ticket sales forced Air France to retire its fleets earlier. On May the 31st, thousands of people gathered at the airport as the last privately chartered Concorde left Paris for a 100-minute flight around the Bay of Biscay. The same day, the last commercial flight returned from the round trip to New York with emotional scenes at both airports. These last two French Concorde aircraft retired to museums. The British Airways fleet made a series of farewell flights in October, beginning with the US and Canada, followed by visits to UK cities, thrilling crowds with low flyovers. On the 24th, 3 Concorde aircraft circled at low altitude over London before landing in a sequence at Heathrow, taxiing around the airport in a 45-minute farewell to the people. The tragic Concorde crash had ramifications for the entire aviation industry. It resulted in modifications adopted by other aircraft, particularly the burst-resistant tires. It also highlighted the runway debris problem. Way ahead of its time, the Concorde proved that supersonic passenger flight was a reality, inspiring companies today to continue where the Concorde left off.
Clearly it was its ability to do things which no other aircraft could do, and also it was this leap into the unknown in a way, because up to then supersonic aircraft had been fighters flown by super fit young men. This provided transport for anyone at supersonic speeds, cutting the distance on long-haul flights across the Atlantic, for example, from the usual 8 hours down to less than 3.
There's no doubt a flight on the Concorde was beyond many people's reach, but it still was universally loved and admired. It was exciting, inspiring and beautiful, its sonic boom causing a moment of awe as it passed overhead, way up in the sky.
I guess I always knew that Concorde would be something that would have a history and a life way beyond her flying days, because she turned heads, even in the latter days. You know, when Concorde flew over, people stopped and looked up. And the psychologists tell us that it's because she mixed technology with beauty, and half of the human brain responds to technology, the other half to beauty. And I think, you know, she's an iconic aircraft for both the 20th and the 21st century, and will remain a great attraction to the public here at Brooklands Museum for many years to come.
A decade after the Concorde crash, it remains a hot topic still in the courts. Probably we'll never really know the answers. What we do know is that the Concorde was a remarkable achievement and proof that sometimes when we aim really high, we can get there.